Hey, what's up? Glowy Fed here. Last week I did my top 5 best presidents of all time. Now I will do the top 5 worst presidents of all time. I'm sure this won't be controversial at all. Again, this is not my opinion. This is the objective truth because I am way smarter than you, and if you disagree with me,
I will erase your whole bloodline!
With that obvious sarcasm out of the way, let's commence, shall we? Number 5. Richard Nixon. Now, let's ignore the Watergate scandal where Nixon was found that he was spying on his political opponents and also his own people from his own administration. Let's ignore the fact that through an executive order he imposed wages and price controls by freezing them for 90 days to counter inflation. And that only worsened the inflation in the years to come. Let's ignore the fact that during his presidential campaign, he promised to end the Vietnam War, only to break that promise by dragging the war for 5 more years. Let's ignore the fact that he shares part of the blame with his best buddy, Henry Kissinger, a garbage human being that I made a whole video about him. Watch it after you watch this, alright? He was responsible for bombing Cambodia and Laos, dropping millions of tons of bombs, sending them back to the Stone Age, and chemicals that caused cancer for generations to come for the people of Indochina. He started the infamous war on drugs that we all know it caused more harm than what good was intended to enforce, making drug cartels even stronger than before, making Mexico's drug cartels militarized and making the drug manufacturers even more professional than before, leading to massive corruption inside the DEA, and the USA is still greatly affected by that policy. But I think that abandoning the gold standards was the worst policy of his administration, and the dollar began to massively lose its value and all the other currencies inside Europe, and now they are not backed by gold anymore. And now the dollar is more worthless than the paper it's printed on. This single policy has destroyed the currencies around the globe, and now we pay for it. And in the future will get much worse. So thanks, Nixon, you crook. Well, he maintained a relatively good foreign policy with the Soviet Union and China. Too bad the future presidents didn't. Number 4. George W. Bush. Where do I begin? Let's start with a non-controversial subject, okay? Let's start with, let's say, 9/11. I'm not gonna explain here how it was proven to be an inside job and who did it, because I want to keep my channel for a little while longer. But I believe you, dear viewer, are smart enough to know and figure out for yourself.
Also, don't Google the dancing Israelis.
I will talk about how he responded to the 9/11 attacks to justify war with Iraq based on a lie that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons that was proven he didn't have them. The war in Afghanistan that he caused and spanned 20 years and costed, according to Forbes, $2.4 trillion. With that amount of money, USA could feed all their homeless and feed all the poor people in USA for at least 2 decades, and also buy housing for them. Let that sink in. And also annex Canada in the process. He's the one that signed the law that perhaps sealed USA's fate and stripped away any freedom Americans had. And that is the Patriot Act. Edward Snowden and Julian Assange exposed this, and how every single device in USA was tracked, bugged, and listened by the CIA, FBI, and Homeland Security in the name of combating terrorism. With this single law, USA has become what George Orwell predicted in his novel 1984, which I encourage each and every one of you to read. Ever since this law passed, USA had become a surveillance totalitarian state disguised as a democracy. Oh, and let's not forget that the 2008 financial crisis happened under his watch, or as economists like to call it, the Great Recession of the 21st century. What was Bush's response? Print trillions of dollars out of thin air and bail out every single Fortune 500 company that failed and went under, causing massive inflation and also setting a precedent for Joe Biden to do the same in 2024, and devaluing the dollar even more, artificially sustaining a dead economy based on nothing tangible. Ah yes! Crony capitalism, meaning socialism for the rich and poverty for the poor. Number 3. Woodrow Wilson. If you hate the gradual income tax, be sure to thank good old Wilson for that. He lowered tariffs to an all-time low and discouraged the production of American homemade products, a precedent most Democrat presidents followed. He massively grew the power of the federal government by signing executive order after executive order. He established and popularized the American imperialism foreign policy on the basis that, and I quote, America should export its values throughout the globe, spread democracy, and encourage countries around the globe to self-governance. I personally never heard a bigger oxymoron than this in my entire life. He believed that America should have an interventionist foreign policy to further USA's interests and spread democracy throughout the world. This type of foreign policy is often referred to as Wilsonian, or later it would be known as Realpolitik, a term popularized by the foreign policy of figures such as Henry Kissinger. Wilson was voted into office for the second term on the promise that the USA will not join World War I. Guess how that turned out? Wilson managed to pass the Espionage Act, a law that is still in effect to this day that silenced any dissent to any future war effort. So if you criticize the government that it should not declare war or be involved in a foreign war, you will be silenced. Furthermore, he later passed the Sedition Act, which is an amendment to the Espionage Act. The Sedition Act made it a prosecutable offense if you print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, the Constitution of the United States, the military, or the naval forces, or the flag. So basically, if you question anything important, you go to jail! He totally ignored the first Red Scare when millions of Americans were brainwashed by the international communists and subverters and got deeply entrenched in Hollywood and inside the US government. He ignored lynchings, he ignored protests, he ignored everyone. But the worst thing he ever did was the Federal Reserve Act, which he sealed USA's fate and also the fate of the world, giving it to the banks. Since then, every war moving forward was a banker's war. The Rothschild and Sons and their other proxies, John D. Rockefeller, Citibank, and JP Morgan, set up 12 privately owned Federal Reserve banks across the United States as they were authorized by the Act, and prepared to start lending to the US government unlimited money in time of war, for an interest of course. And the Rothschilds and the other banks in Germany and Switzerland prepared to finance the Kaiser Wilhelm II and financed both sides of World War I. Buddy, Believe me when I'm telling you, you don't hate banks enough! Thankfully, Woodrow Wilson did the best thing he ever did in his entire life. He had a stroke! And died! Fuck you, Wilson! Number 2. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I mean, what can you expect from a guy that marries his own cousin? He is the president that grew the role and the power of the federal government the most, transforming USA into an imperialistic and authoritarian superpower. The New Deal Act he passed destroyed all the small businesses in USA and prolonged the Great Depression. The Agriculture Adjustment Act of 1933 raised the prices of crops to keep farmers from not losing their businesses. This was when the Great Depression was at an all-time high in USA, and already struggling people had to pay even more for food. Yeah, great job, you stupid cripple. And then what happened? America didn't produce enough crops and they became reliant on outside countries to buy from them. He created the terrible system of social security, which was sold as an insurance program, but in reality it was just a flat tax on wages with a very uneven and inequitable system of giving benefits, from which very few actually benefited, but most didn't get anything. He had the federal government confiscate and make illegal the ownership of gold and force the people that owned gold to sell it to the federal bank at a low price, except for jewelry. Before the total abandonment of the gold standard by Richard Nixon, FDR suspended for a while the dollar from the gold standard in 1933. Roosevelt, despite knowing from his Navy generals in the Pacific that the Japanese would bomb either Ellis Island or Hawaii, he did nothing and let the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, killing thousands of US troops to justify a war with both Japan and Germany. USA entering World War II, securing his legacy knowing that USA will be the silver bullet to win the war against Japan and a little help for the Western Front in Europe. So no, the USA didn't win World War II. The Soviet Union did. They did 95% of the job, they killed 20 million of their own people on the Eastern Front, and USA paid for their supplies, so blow me, you historians! Oh, and speaking of which, top officials inside the US government at that time were very supportive of the Soviet totalitarian regime. Diana West wrote this book, American Betrayal, where she brings evidence and addresses the elephant in the room that the US government during FDR's administration was filled to the brim with Soviet spies. FDR was perhaps the original suppressor of the free press. He built the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, where he made it almost impossible for news networks to establish their own studios and broadcast through radio. He used the CBS to censor and silence any criticism against him. And perhaps the worst thing he ever did was passing the Executive Order 9066. And that was creating concentration camps for all Americans with Japanese ancestry. More than 150,000 Japanese Americans were rounded up and arrested without a warrant and without any basis. What was their crime? Being Japanese. I made a whole video about how USA tried to destroy the Japanese culture. Check it out after you watch this video. As you all know, history is written by the victor, of course, and the mainstream media and the mainstream historians view FDR as one of the best US presidents of all time. Yeah, I hope you burn in hell, you fucking cripple. Dishonorable mention: Barack Obama and Joe Biden. Now, I will cheat a little bit and I will put those presidents back to back since they are the same administration, only under a different name. Okay, let's not pretend that's not the case, alright? Let's start with Barack Hussein Obama. He did the exact same thing George W. Bush did. The exact same foreign policy. He continued the Iraq War, he continued the Afghanistan War, only now he also bombed Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, and hundreds of hospitals throughout the Middle East. He destabilized Libya and assassinated Gaddafi without the United Nations approval or even counsel. Libya was a country that was very prosperous under the dictatorship of Muammar Gaddafi, despite what any Western media lies are trying to sell you. And he was also responsible for millions of Libyan refugees displaced, and Europe bear the consequence and inherited a migrant crisis that destroys Europe as we speak. Healthcare under Obama and also Biden was so expensive, Americans were better off going to Russia, Turkey, or even Canada to treat themselves. The world's most powerful nation, yet they are unable to provide healthcare for their own citizens. What a crude irony. Now let's talk a little bit about Biden. Well, not about him specifically. I mean, he's clinically on life support. I mean, even Jimmy Carter has more cognitive power than him. Poor guy. No, I'm talking about his administration. Let's start with the rampant inflation and all the prices that are going through the roof and stagnant wages that can't keep up with the prices. USA today experiences perhaps the worst inflation in its history due to too much money printing. Fun fact! Trump also contributed to this inflation, although he contributed in the last months of his terms due to COVID-19. He had to bail out all his corporate butt buddies, and also, let's not forget, the stimulus checks every American received. Biden doubled down and made it 10 times worse! Another fun fact! Did you know that in the last 5 years, USA printed 50% of all the money they ever printed in history since 1776. I'm sure that will have no consequences in the future at all. Under the Biden administration, USA welcomed the most illegal immigrants in US history. Over 8 million immigrants penetrated the country through the Mexico border, leading to massive internal fighting, creating an opioid crisis.
Off the record, China is responsible for the opioid crisis, but that's a video for another day.
It is true that Trump divided the country, there's no secret about it, but Biden only made it worse and also made many liberals defect to the conservative camp. This will not end well for USA. This guy over here, Tyler Oliveira, has a great YouTube channel where he goes to every city in USA and documents how decadent, how filthy, and how much in a state of crisis USA is now under the Biden and Harris administration. Check this guy out, he has one of the best channels on YouTube. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. The president that divided USA like no other in history. The president that is responsible for the most American deaths under his administration. The president that was America's first dictator. The president that is viewed by history as a savior, as a protector, as a liberator, when in reality he was a tyrant who suppressed any dissenting voice and also the only president that fired upon his own people. I'm of course talking about Abraham Lincoln. What? Are you shocked? Were you waiting for a punchline? There is no punchline! He is the worst president USA ever had. And of course, I will have to justify this outrageous statement since history is written by liars and crooks, and most of you sheeps take history at face value. So, here it goes. Lincoln is often seen as the great emancipator. Problem is, he never emancipated a single slave. Why? Because when the 13th Amendment passed, it applied to the southern states, the Confederate States. During the Civil War, the Union, at that time, didn't control a single Confederate state. More so, need I remind you that the Northerners, the Union, had special infantry divisions made of slaves that they used as a shield whenever they attacked the Confederacy? Oh, also, need I remind you that the state of Illinois forbade blacks to even live there? Oh, and also the Confederacy didn't have a single slave in the military ranks because they saw them as too valuable, being their literal property to lose in a war. You all have to understand that at that time, having a slave would be very expensive. Having a slave was the luxury of a rich man. Most rich people were Northerners. Of course, the Confederacy had also a lot of slaves, but they were used for cotton picking, for farming in general. However, the North was more industrialized than the South. The South would also industrialize, albeit at a slower pace, but slavery would eventually disappear with or without the war, because there wouldn't be a need for slaves, so slavery would eventually disappear. There was no need for a civil war. Europe has ended slavery without firing a single bullet. How? Compensation from the state, of course! The Lincoln Proclamation would take effect in the time of Ulysses S. Grant, 8 years after the Civil War ended. If Abraham Lincoln truly wanted to end slavery, why didn't he put a law that provided compensation for every slave owner with all the powers he had? The London Spectator, a newspaper from Britain, said it best, quote, "The principle is not that a human being cannot justly own another, but that he cannot own him if he is not loyal to the United States." Point is, the Civil War was never fought for the liberation of slaves. It was fought over financial reasons, like 95% of all the wars that existed in human history. Also, the Civil War started because the Union, and more specifically Lincoln, wanted to preserve the Union. However, it is written in the Constitution of the United States that any state has the right to secession. Case closed. The Military Conscription Act was passed by Lincoln, an act that is still in effect as of today. This is why every single boy past the age of 18 can be drafted at a moment's notice thanks to Abraham Lincoln. The secession of the Confederacy was never about slavery. It was about genuine grievances the South had, like massive tariffs, underrepresentation in the Senate, and also the House of Representatives. You want more evidence for Lincoln being basically Stalin before Stalin? Take this letter that was an order to General John Dix. Quote, "You will take possession by military force of the printing establishments of the New York World and Journal of Commerce, and prohibit any further publication thereof. You are therefore commanded forthwith to address and imprison the editors, proprietors, and publishers of the aforementioned newspapers." May 18th, 1864. Honest Abe, everyone. Clement Vallandigham was an Ohio congressman who criticized Lincoln, saying that his assumption of war powers are unconstitutional. Later, Lincoln put General Burnside to arrest him. Honest Abe, everyone. Also, in the Constitution, it is said that the Congress, not the President, can assume wartime emergency powers if the vote passes. Lincoln invented those emergency powers. William H. Seward, the Secretary of the State under Lincoln, created a secret police force which arrested thousands of citizens for disloyalty. Lincoln arrested the entire state legislature of the state of Maryland because they wanted to secede from the Union. Oh, and they weren't the only ones. Over 13,000 political opponents and journalists in the North were arrested without any charges. But I think the most disgusting and brutal show of Lincoln's tyranny was in July 1863, when in New York were draft riots. Because normally, people didn't want to be drafted into the army to kill their own brothers in the South. What did Lincoln do? Ordered the police to fire upon their own people, killing hundreds of people and injuring more than 2,000. Honest Abe, everyone. Lincoln inherited a secession crisis, yes, but he manufactured the Civil War. Look at this quote from none other than his aide, John Nicolay. Abstractly, it was enough that the government was in the right. But to make the issue sure, Lincoln determined that in addition, the rebellion, he was talking about the Confederate States that seceded, should be put in the wrong. Lincoln gave up Fort Sumter to the South, even though he reinforced the fort with an armed escort and they had specific orders to not fire unless fired upon. The Confederate soldiers took the bait and fired upon them, making them look like they fired first, justifying the start of the Civil War. This is your Honest Abe, ladies and gentlemen. The only president in the history of USA that started a war against his own people, a war that lasted more than 4 years and killed millions of Americans, both civilians and soldiers. And this is why he is ranked as my #1 worst president USA ever had. If today's news are fake, imagine what history is. Oh, and one more thing. Don't you dare call me a lost causer, okay? I'm not even from the USA, and I have no allegiances to the Confederacy, okay? I'll place my knapsack on my back, my rifle on my shoulder. I'll march your way to the firing line. Kill that Yankee soldier, I kill that Yankee soldier. I'll march your way to the firing line and kill that Yankee soldier. Wait. Oh shit.
Subscribe, you silly Billy.